History remembers him as a monster. To some, he was Rome's most depraved emperor, a man whose cruelty knew no limits, and whose pleasures demanded rivers of gold, wine, and blood. His name was Nero, and at the heart of his infamy were the feasts, banquets so excessive, so indulgent, that they blurred the line between celebration and nightmare. To step into one of Nero's feasts was to enter a world where no appetite was denied, no boundary respected, and no cost too high. It was not dining. It was theater, ritual, and madness served on golden plates. From the moment Nero seized power, extravagance became his signature. While other emperors had sought to display Rome's wealth through monuments, Nero displayed it at the dinner table. His banquets were not evenings, they were marathons, stretching into days and nights, as if time itself bent to his gluttony. Guests invited to these spectacles found themselves drowning in abundance. Dishes of exotic meats, peacocks roasted whole, flamingo tongues prepared with honey, oysters and fish hauled in from distant seas, fruits imported from the edges of the empire. Nothing was too rare, too strange, or too costly for Nero's appetite. But food was only the beginning. The dining halls themselves were wonders crafted to impress and intimidate. Nero had ceilings fitted with panels that would slide open, releasing showers of rose petals and streams of perfume upon his guests. Some claimed that at one feast, the petals were released in such abundance that guests suffocated beneath the weight of flowers, their deaths dismissed as a small price to pay for imperial spectacle. The walls glittered with gold, silver, and polished marble. Musicians played endlessly, their songs competing with the roar of laughter, the clinking of goblets, and the groans of overstuffed guests. For Nero, banquets were not mere indulgence, they were performance. He fancied himself a great artist, a poet, a musician, even a god. And so, between courses, he would rise to sing before his audience. Senators, generals, noblewomen, all were forced to sit and applaud as their emperor sang verses or strummed a lyre. None dared criticize, for fear of his wrath. Applause was compulsory, and flattery was survival. Every banquet was both a feast and a stage upon which Nero demanded worship disguised as entertainment. What separated Nero's banquets from mere decadence was the sheer scale. These feasts could last an entire week, each day bringing new waves of food, drink, and spectacle. Slaves staggered beneath trays piled with delicacies. Amphorae of wine were emptied by the hour. Guests drank until their senses blurred, then vomited, only to eat and drink again. For the emperor, restraint was an insult. Moderation was treason. To live like Nero was to live without limits, and he expected his guests to join him in that endless hunger. But indulgence was only one side of these gatherings. The other side was intimidation. Every invitation to Nero's banquet was both an honor and a threat. To refuse was unthinkable. To attend was to witness the emperor's power in its most grotesque form. Here, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, senators and nobles were reminded that Nero controlled not only Rome's treasury but their very lives. At any moment, a jest could turn into humiliation. A glance could become a command. And a guest could find themselves the target of imperial amusement. Eyewitness accounts describe how Nero would sometimes seat guests on couches that suddenly collapsed, sending them sprawling to the floor while the emperor roared with laughter. At other times, he would replace fine dishes with grotesque imitations, serving donkey meat disguised as venison, or bread dyed with blood to shock his diners. For Nero, cruelty was as much a delicacy as roasted swan or spiced fish. To watch others squirm, to remind them that their dignity was his plaything, this was part of the feast. Nero's obsession with excess extended beyond food and entertainment to the very fabric of Roman society. Vast sums of money were poured into these spectacles. Grain that might have fed thousands was squandered on luxury dishes. Gold that could have built fortifications was melted into goblets and platters. At a time when Rome's provinces groaned under heavy taxes and famines stalked the countryside, the emperor devoured the empire's wealth in orgies of gluttony. His banquets were not only excess, they were theft, the bleeding of a nation to feed one man's vanity. And yet, for those present, the experience was intoxicating. To dine with Nero was to taste power itself. Guests gorged themselves on delicacies they could never have afforded on their own. They drank wines older than the empire. They basked in music, flowers, and perfumes that seemed to dissolve the boundaries between reality and dream. For some, the banquets were heaven on earth. For others, they were hell disguised as paradise. The truth was, Nero's feasts were not only about pleasure. They were about control. Every dish, every song, every shower of petals was designed to remind his guests that they lived in the shadow of a man who styled himself as more than emperor, as a living god. To eat at his table was to surrender, to acknowledge his absolute dominance. For while the senators and nobles stuffed themselves with meat and wine, they were also swallowing humiliation, binding themselves to Nero with every bite. This was the essence of Nero's excess, not simply indulgence, but domination through indulgence. His banquets were weapons as much as they were feasts. By drowning his guests in luxury, he ensured their dependence. By humiliating them in laughter, he secured their fear. And by demanding their applause, he chained them in loyalty. But even in these golden halls, the seeds of discontent were planted. For as much as Nero dazzled his guests, he disgusted them too. Behind forced smiles and clapping hands, many whispered of his madness. They saw an emperor more concerned with his own pleasures than the stability of Rome. They saw grain wasted while citizens starved, gold squandered while legions demanded pay. They saw a ruler who treated the empire as his banquet, devouring its wealth with insatiable hunger. And though his guests played along, the memory of those nights lingered. Rose petals may have suffocated some, but it was Nero's excess that suffocated Rome itself. His banquets were not simply parties, they were omens. Omens of a rule where cruelty and indulgence outweighed reason, and where the line between emperor and tyrant dissolved in rivers of wine. Nero's excess was his glory. It was also his curse. For what began as spectacle would, in time, fuel the whispers of rebellion. The very feasts that made him seem untouchable would expose him as vulnerable. Rome could endure decadence, but it could not endure betrayal of its values. And as Nero raised his goblet, toasting his own greatness, the empire he ruled was already beginning to choke. For Nero, feasting was never just about food. It was about power. And to him, power was most thrilling when it was cruel. The banquets of Rome's infamous emperor became more than spectacles of excess, they became theaters of domination, stages where humiliation and suffering were served alongside roasted meats and rivers of wine. In Nero's hands, dinner was not only a meal. It was a weapon. Guests who entered his palace quickly learned that they were stepping into a world where the emperor's pleasure mattered more than their dignity, or even their lives. To decline an invitation was dangerous. To attend meant surrendering to Nero's unpredictable whims. At one moment, a guest might be showered with gifts, golden cups, jeweled rings, estates promised with a gesture of the hand. And in the next, that same guest might be ridiculed, stripped of honor, or forced to watch horrors unfold as the emperor laughed. Historians tell us that cruelty seeped into every aspect of these gatherings. Gladiatorial combat, once reserved for arenas, sometimes appeared within the dining halls. While guests reclined on couches and sipped their wine, slaves and condemned prisoners were forced to fight to the death before them. Blood mixed with spilled wine on marble floors. For Nero, these moments were not interruptions, they were entertainment. What could pair better with sweet honeyed figs than the screams of a dying man? But even death was not always swift. Nero delighted in humiliations that prolonged agony. At times, guests were forced to watch executions carried out as if they were stage plays. Prisoners dressed in costumes from Greek tragedies were slaughtered in ways that mimicked the myths. A man might be burned alive as if he were Hercules, or torn apart like Orpheus. To Nero, cruelty was art. And his banquets were his canvas. For the senators and noblemen seated around the table, these spectacles were traps. To grimace at the cruelty was dangerous. To refuse to watch was treason. Applause and laughter were expected, even demanded, while the emperor reveled in the blending of pain and pleasure. Every smile a senator forced, every toast he raised, became another chain binding him to Nero's madness. The banquet hall was not just a place of indulgence. It was a prison gilded in gold, where the emperor held Rome's elite hostage to his cruelty. Cruelty also extended to the very guests themselves. Nero was a master of humiliation, and he found endless ways to degrade the powerful men and women of Rome. He might command a senator to dance drunkenly before the crowd, or force a noblewoman to sing while he mocked her voice. Sometimes, he would dress his guests in ridiculous costumes, laughing as generals and statesmen paraded like fools before their emperor. Those who refused risked exile, confiscation of property, or worse. Laughter in Nero's palace was never innocent, it was sharpened like a blade, cutting pride to pieces. The feasts also served another purpose: control through fear. By blending generosity with cruelty, Nero kept his guests uncertain, off balance. One night, he might grant a man riches beyond imagination. The next, he might strip him of everything. To live in Nero's circle was to walk on shifting sands, never knowing whether you would rise to glory or sink into ruin. In this way, every banquet reinforced his dominance. The emperor's pleasure was absolute law, and cruelty was its enforcement. But perhaps the most disturbing element of these banquets was how ordinary Romans were drawn into their orbit. Nero's palace gates sometimes opened to the masses, allowing the common people to glimpse the excess within. To them, it was a spectacle of awe and terror, an emperor so powerful he could drown himself in food, wine, and blood without consequence. The cruelty that horrified Rome's elite often entertained the crowds, who cheered as gladiators fought and prisoners screamed. In pleasing the mob with blood, Nero strengthened his grip. Bread and circuses had always fed Rome, but under Nero, the bread was gilded, and the circuses dripped with cruelty. Yet cruelty, like wine, has a way of fermenting bitterness. Behind their forced smiles, Rome's senators seethed. They saw their dignity stripped, their traditions mocked. They saw the treasury drained into banquets while provinces rebelled and legions went unpaid. They saw a ruler who fed his pleasures while the empire cracked. And though fear kept their lips sealed at the table, whispers began to spread beyond the walls. Whispers that Rome was rotting under the weight of its emperor's cruelty. Still, for a time, Nero thrived. He believed himself untouchable. The banquets grew larger, stranger, more grotesque. Musicians played while men were tortured. Courtesans laughed as blood stained their gowns. Guests raised goblets, pretending to toast, while inside they prayed for release. And through it all, Nero sat at the center, a smile carved across his face, intoxicated not by wine but by the sight of power breaking men in half. In these banquets, the true nature of Nero's reign revealed itself. It was not just tyranny. It was theater. Every act of cruelty was staged, every humiliation choreographed, every scream amplified by the marble walls to echo the emperor's delight. To Nero, ruling Rome was not about justice or governance. It was about performance. And the stage he built was soaked in blood. But what Nero failed to see was how fragile his theater really was. Cruelty can command silence, but it cannot command loyalty forever. Fear can bind men's tongues, but it cannot bind their hearts. And while the emperor laughed at his feasts, outside the palace walls, resentment was growing. His banquets dazzled the senses, but they also poisoned the soul of Rome. The cruelty that thrilled Nero would, in time, disgust the world. His excesses would not be forgotten. They would be remembered as warnings, carved into history, reminders of how power corrupts when fed by cruelty. But at the height of his glory, as goblets overflowed and blood spilled on marble floors, Nero did not see the shadows gathering. He saw only adoration, only applause, only the reflection of his own madness in the terrified eyes of his guests. And so, his feasts continued, each one darker than the last. The line between banquet and execution blurred. The dining hall became a stage of horror disguised as luxury. And the emperor of Rome became not a ruler, but a ringmaster of cruelty. If Nero's feasts were known for excess and cruelty, they were equally infamous for something else: lust. Behind the heavy curtains of the palace, when the plates of peacock and flamingo tongues were cleared away, when the goblets had been refilled a dozen times, the banquets often dissolved into something far darker. What began as dining and performance ended as ritualistic orgies, spectacles of lust where power, humiliation, and perversion mingled under the gaze of Rome's most dangerous man. To Nero, sex was not private. It was public theater. His palace halls, glittering with gold and perfumed with incense, became arenas of lust. Senators' wives, noble daughters, courtesans, and slaves alike were drawn into the whirlpool. Few came willingly, but none could refuse. To be invited to the emperor's table was an honor that could not be declined, and to resist his desires was unthinkable. And so, the feasts became stages where bodies replaced food as entertainment, and pleasure was performed like a play. Historians record tales of Nero forcing Rome's elite to strip before him, men and women alike, compelling them to dance or couple while he watched with delight. Sometimes, he joined in. Sometimes, he commanded others to. For him, it was not simply indulgence, it was domination. Every act of lust, every gasp of humiliation, was a reminder that Nero's power extended even to the most intimate corners of human life. The orgies were not spontaneous, they were ritualized. There were times when Nero dressed as a god, cloaking himself in silk and jewels, demanding that others play the roles of goddesses and consorts. He cast himself as Apollo, as Bacchus, even as Venus, and forced his guests to enact divine unions in his presence. In this twisted theater, religion and perversion became one. To Nero, lust was not sin, it was ceremony. The emperor also blurred the line between gender and role. Ancient sources describe him taking both male and female lovers, flaunting relationships with young men and humiliating Rome's most respected matrons. He even went so far as to marry one of his male slaves in a mock wedding, playing the bride himself, veiled and adorned, consummating the marriage before an audience of laughing, terrified guests. In another infamous incident, he married a young boy named Sporus, whom he had castrated, and paraded him as his empress. To Nero, nothing was forbidden. Everything could be turned into performance. For the guests, participation was not choice, it was survival. To refuse was to risk exile, confiscation of wealth, even death. Many complied, shamed and broken, their reputations destroyed, their families humiliated. Rome's proud elite, who once ruled provinces and commanded armies, now found themselves reduced to actors in the emperor's play of lust. The orgies were not simply about Nero's pleasure, they were about erasing the pride of Rome's nobility, binding them in complicity, ensuring that they could never stand against him. The scenes were grotesque in their excess. Oil lamps dimmed, shadows danced across marble walls, musicians played soft melodies as the hall transformed into a theater of flesh. Guests paired and repaired at Nero's command. Masks were distributed, so that identities blurred, and shame became anonymity. What was forbidden in the daylight of Rome's laws became sacred in the darkness of the palace. Adultery, sodomy, even incestuous pairings were rumored to have been staged as rituals, each act justified by Nero as imitating the gods or celebrating the power of Bacchus, the god of wine and ecstasy. But what seemed like endless pleasure was often terror in disguise. Women taken from their husbands, men stripped before their peers, slaves used and discarded, all knew that saying no was impossible. The laughter that echoed through the halls was not joy, it was forced, brittle, a desperate attempt to survive the night. To be summoned to Nero's bed was as dangerous as being summoned to his court. Both could destroy you. The emperor's lust also spilled into the streets. During certain festivals, he is said to have disguised himself and prowled Rome by night, seizing women and boys, dragging them into dark alleys, indulging his appetites with the city as his playground. In his palace, these impulses were magnified. What he practiced in shadows, he performed in gold-lit chambers, turning personal vice into public ritual. And yet, amid the terror, there were those who reveled in it. Some courtesans and sycophants thrived in the orgies, gaining favor, wealth, or power through their performances. For them, lust was currency, and Nero paid well. But for everyone who prospered, dozens were broken, shamed, scarred, or discarded when the emperor grew bored. Pleasure under Nero was never free. It always came at a price. The legacy of these orgies outlived him. Roman historians, even those prone to exaggeration, consistently painted Nero as a ruler consumed by lust. They described his palace not as a seat of governance but as a brothel of the highest order, where senators and noblewomen were degraded alongside slaves. To them, the orgies were not only perverse, they were evidence of Rome's moral decay under Nero's reign. The emperor who should have embodied Roman virtue instead embodied its corruption. But perhaps the most chilling truth is that these rituals of lust were not isolated to Nero alone. Rome had long tolerated decadence, and emperors before him had indulged their appetites. What set Nero apart was how public, how theatrical, how ritualized his lust became. He turned the most intimate act into a political tool, binding his court in shame and guilt, ensuring their silence through complicity. In his world, sex was no longer private, it was politics, performance, and punishment. And though his guests endured it, though they smiled and applauded, though they raised goblets to toast his name, resentment festered. No man likes to be humiliated forever. No woman forgives the theft of her dignity. And as Nero's orgies grew more grotesque, as his rituals of lust stripped Rome's elite of their pride, the seeds of betrayal were quietly sown. For now, though, Nero reigned supreme in his palace of gold and flesh. Every banquet ended in lust, every ritual reinforced his godlike fantasy, every act of humiliation tightened his grip. The emperor believed he was untouchable, immortal, a god among men. But outside the palace walls, the city watched. The people whispered. The empire remembered. And lust, like cruelty, has a way of turning pleasure into poison. No empire collapses in a single night. Decline begins in whispers, in dissatisfaction, in quiet discontent that grows too heavy to ignore. For Nero, the whispers began long before his downfall. They were murmured in the corridors of the Senate, carried on the tongues of Rome's generals, and breathed by a people weary of famine, fire, and fear. His blood-soaked banquets, once spectacles of awe, became symbols of everything Rome despised: waste, cruelty, and corruption. The emperor had mistaken indulgence for immortality, but decadence always has a price. The treasury of Rome bled beneath Nero's hand. Every feast drained it further. Gold goblets, silver platters, fountains of wine, what dazzled his guests emptied the empire's coffers. Provinces were taxed until they rebelled. Grain shipments were hoarded for the emperor's tables while citizens rioted for bread. Nero built his legendary Golden House, a palace sprawling across acres of Rome, its halls filled with jewels, its ceilings painted like the heavens. Yet to the people who starved outside its gates, it was not a marvel. It was a wound. And then came the fire. In the year 64 CE, flames consumed Rome. 4 days, the city burned, reducing temples, homes, and markets to ash. Thousands perished, tens of thousands were left homeless. Rumors spread like smoke that Nero himself had ordered the fire to clear space for his Golden House. Whether true or not, the damage to his reputation was irreversible. The people whispered that while Rome burned, Nero stood on a balcony, singing of Troy's destruction, delighted by the spectacle. In that moment, the emperor's feasts and flames merged into one image: Nero devouring Rome itself. To quell suspicion, Nero needed scapegoats. And so, he turned on a small, despised sect, the Christians. They were accused of setting the fire. Nero's cruelty staged their deaths as entertainment. In his gardens, Christians were burned alive, their bodies set alight to illuminate the night feasts. Guests drank wine beneath the glow of human torches. The cruelty that once shocked Rome's elite now horrified the world. Nero had turned persecution into spectacle, blood into decoration. His feasts were no longer symbols of power. They were indictments. Inside the palace, decadence continued. Night after night, Nero demanded music, poetry, performance. He saw himself not as a ruler, but as an artist. He forced nobles to watch him sing, compelled generals to applaud his plays. The Emperor of Rome became its clown, humiliating the empire on foreign stages. When he performed in Greece, competing in theatrical contests, victory was guaranteed, for who dared deny him? The Senate gritted its teeth, the people groaned. The line between emperor and madman had vanished. Meanwhile, Rome's enemies stirred. Rebellions flared in the provinces. Generals lost faith. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal protectors, now whispered of betrayal. The emperor who had squandered their loyalty on orgies and song could no longer command their fear. Decadence had eroded authority. Lust had weakened respect. Cruelty had planted seeds of vengeance. The foundations of power crumbled beneath him. The end came not with a banquet, but with abandonment. When revolt spread through the empire, Nero sought refuge in the loyalty of his guards. But when he called, they did not come. Senators declared him a public enemy. The people, once bribed with bread and dazzled with circuses, now cursed his name. Alone, deserted, Nero fled the city. In a villa outside Rome, trembling, he begged for someone to take his life. None would. And so, on June 9, 68 CE, the emperor who had drowned Rome in wine and blood took a dagger to his own throat, whispering, "What an artist dies in me." His death did not erase the memory of his banquets. If anything, it immortalized them. To the world, Nero became the symbol of decadence, an emperor who feasted while his empire starved, who sang while his city burned, who turned cruelty and lust into ritual. His name became synonymous with tyranny and perversion. Historians wrote of him with venom, preserving every grotesque detail so that future generations would never forget. And yet, his feasts remained strangely fascinating. They were nightmares, yes, but also glimpses into the fragility of power. They show us how a man cloaked in divinity can become enslaved to his appetites, how an empire that worshipped discipline and virtue could be brought low by gluttony and vice. The banquets of Nero were not just excess, they were prophecy. They foretold that Rome, too, would one day collapse under the weight of its own indulgence. Standing in the ruins of the Golden House today, one can almost hear the echoes. The clinking of goblets, the laughter of terrified guests, the cries of prisoners forced to die as entertainment. The petals falling from ceilings, smothering the breath of those below. The whispers of nobles, plotting rebellion even as they raised their glasses. History lingers in those stones, a warning written in shadow and silence, that decadence devours, that cruelty corrupts, and that no banquet lasts forever. Nero believed his feasts were eternal. But time has stripped them bare. What remains is not the taste of flamingo tongues or the scent of perfumes, but the memory of a ruler destroyed by his own indulgence. His blood-soaked banquets, once symbols of power, now stand as monuments to downfall. They remind us that empires can fall not from enemy swords, but from within, from greed, from lust, from cruelty disguised as pleasure. So when you hear the name Nero, remember not just the emperor, but the table. The endless banquets, the cruelty, the orgies, the waste. Remember how he fed on Rome until there was nothing left but ashes. And remember that every empire, no matter how mighty, can be undone by the hunger of one man. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden piece of history, tap like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The next dark tale is already on its way.